Mulliganing is hard, and it's also one of the most important parts of playing EDH or any other format of Magic. If you fail to mulligan correctly, an otherwise perfectly good and playable deck may end up losing every single game. This is actually a lesson I have to learn every time I get back into playing Arena. Without fail, when I pick up Historic again after a year or a few months without playing, I find myself getting stuck in either the gold or platinum bracket. But as soon as I start mulliganing more aggressively and getting serious about having a good opening hand, I find that the exact same deck being played in essentially the same way can now get me easily into Mythic. Now, in this video, I'm not going to talk about Arena, I'm going to talk about Commander. But regardless of what format we play, the reason we mulligan is to reduce how much of a factor luck is. And for me, the process of mulliganing starts with understanding your deck composition. Let's take a very simple example. If you're playing Krenko and have 2 lands in your opening hand, and your plan is to have 4 mana by turn 4 to play Krenko, you need to know how many sources of mana you have in your deck in order to decide if you want to keep or not. If your deck has 40 lands and 20 other sources of mana, then you can put those numbers into the hypergeometric calculator and get an idea of your odds of getting 4 mana by turn 4. Given there would be 92 cards remaining in the deck, and 58 of them are mana sources, it looks like I have an 85% chance to get the mana I need to play Krenko by turn 4. The difficult part of statistics isn't generating these numbers, it's deciding if the numbers are good or not. And it's up to you as the person who is piloting the deck. Ultimately, you need to gain experience mulliganing and making decisions, and then over time, you'll learn what odds you like and what odds you don't like. For me personally, 85% would be a little low. This is because it would mean if I play 8 games with this hand, in at least one of them, I won't get to 4 mana on turn 4, and Krenko wouldn't do what I want him to do. However, like with any statistical model, this calculator doesn't consider every possible factor. For example, if I have Sol Ring in my deck, which taps for 2 mana, then I only need to draw it and no additional mana sources to play Krenko. Plus, if I have low-cost card draw like Faithless Looting or Wheel of Fortune, then it's possible I'll draw into these cards, then cast them to draw even more cards, and further increase the odds I'll draw 2 more mana sources. So that number could be quite a bit better than 85%, which would make me feel better about keeping it. Of course, this is a relatively simple example because Krenko is monocolored. In a multicolored deck, you have to keep in mind not just whether or not you'll get enough mana, but also whether or not you'll get the color of mana you need. In a lot of decks, I see people might only have 25 sources of each color of mana, so for those people, if they are missing one color in their opening hand, their odds of drawing that remaining color early in the game are not good. Obviously, there are other factors here, such as cards like Kodama's Reach or Land Tax, which could help you get that remaining color. But the point is you need to be considering all these factors so that you can do some sort of basic statistical calculation, and then based on that calculation, decide whether or not you will keep your hand. And this example also only dealt with mana, but you also have to be thinking about the entirety of what it is exactly you want your deck to do. Most players want their opening hand to be more than just a keepable hand, meaning although it's fine to keep a hand which just has some lands and some spells you can play with those lands, ideally an opening hand contains cards which are directly related to specific early game strategies. For example, most people's decks want to ramp early in the game. This is why most deck building templates tell you to put in 12 pieces of ramp. And in fact, if you've used a deck building template to build your deck, most likely you should just take a mulligan if you don't have at least one piece of ramp. But not all decks are this simple. Krenko is an easy example because a deck like Krenko is typically meant to play Krenko in the first 4 turns of the game and start using his ability to generate goblins. So though ramp could be a bonus, it's also fine just to play goblins on curve until you play Krenko turn 4. Or with my Yoshimaru Kodama deck, I know that I want at least 1 white mana that enters untapped, because I want to play Yoshimaru turn 1 and then start playing permanents to put 1/1 counters on him. So as long as I have that initial white mana to play Yoshimaru, and then I have the mana needed to play some lower mana value legendaries, I'll likely keep that hand. Of course, it's always nice to have ramp in my opening hand, and occasionally there can be times I have an opening hand which doesn't have the white mana I need to play Yoshimaru turn 1, but because it's otherwise a busted start with something like Sol Ring and Kadama's Reach, I will be flexible about my strategy and keep it and play Yoshimaru later in the game instead. Another deck I use as an example a lot is my Giada deck, because she acts as ramp and I can therefore reliably have 4 mana on turn 3. I'll keep my opening hand with 2 to 3 lands and a 4-drop Angel, because that's one of the main plays I'm trying to make in this deck. Of course, what's funny is I wrote this part of the script and then I had a game with my friends last weekend, and in that game I kept what felt like a very strong opening hand with 2 lands in a deck which has 39 lands in it. The game ended up lasting over 2 hours, and somehow I only drew 1 land that entire game. And to top it off, after I drew that 3rd land, sometime around turn 8, one of my friends cast Volcanic Offering and my Nykthos got blown up, putting me back to 2 lands. So of course I'm going to take that memory with me to the grave, and moving forward I'm going to think twice about those 2 land opening hands, and I'm also going to need to reevaluate some of my friendships. Now, there are a lot of other examples I could give, but what really matters is that you know what you want to do with your deck, and you mulligan with that in mind. Of course, knowing what you want your deck to do also means that you know what you don't want your deck to do. Every deck has a range of different cards, and not every card is going to be something you want to see in your opening hand. For example, with the Giada deck, I usually don't want to see the 7 or 8 mana value angels in my opening hand. I have these cards in my deck because I love playing them, but unless I got an insane opening hand with the acceleration cards, I need to cast these big mana angels early on. These cards are actually a strike against keeping a hand, because I'd rather these be literally any other card in the deck, since they're dead cards until I get to 7 or 8 mana. Of course, that can feel bad because part of the whole point of EDH is that we play with these big spells we can't play in other formats, but having these cards in your opening hand doesn't even necessarily give you the best odds of playing them. Instead, it's better if your opening hand contains cards which will set you up to play the big mana cards. Most commonly that's ramp, but it could also just be low cost card draw, which helps you draw into ramp or lands, or maybe even a board wipe or a fog, which will help you stay alive long enough to cast those big mana spells later in the game. Another case can be removal spells. Most people are running removal, but that doesn't mean they want a lot of removal in their opening hand. If your opening hand has a disproportionate amount of spot removal in it, but your deck isn't really designed to draw enough cards to fill your hand up after casting all that spot removal, you could easily find yourself running out of cards, and so you'll likely want to mulligan away that hand full of removal. Of course, sometimes you might specifically want to keep spot removal because you know there is something your opponents will play which you need to get rid of, but that requires knowing what your opponents might do. Now, we're never going to know what our opponent's opening hands are exactly, but we should be able to look at their commanders and have a decent idea as to what their game plan is. Generally speaking, most people are playing creature-heavy decks which plan to ramp in the first 3 to 5 turns of the game, and we can use that knowledge to our advantage when deciding to keep a hand or not. An obvious example is that cards like Land Tax and Archaeomancer's Map are better when there is a green player at the table, but also cards like Wrath of God are a lot better in an opening hand when you know your opponents are going to be playing important creatures early on. If I'm sitting across the table from a Krenko or Edgar, I'm much more likely to want to keep an opening hand with Wrath of God in it, or even try to mulligan down in order to look for a board wipe to help me. But alternatively, if I'm facing decks which might not have many creatures, such as Atraxa Super Friends or a Goshen Tai Enchantress deck, having a Wrath effect in my opening hand increases the odds I'll want to mulligan it away and try to find something more useful. Now, there's one final point I want to make about mulliganing. Don't be afraid to mulligan down. As I mentioned in the intro of this video, often when getting back into Arena, I don't mulligan aggressively enough, and this costs me a lot of games. But once I get more serious and am willing to go as far as mulliganing down to 5 cards, I do a lot better. When we consider that in most EDH decks we have copious amounts of card draw, it shouldn't be too difficult for us to eventually replace the cards we lost. And ultimately, it's better to have a 5-card starting hand that can generate card advantage over a 7-card hand which only becomes playable after some lucky draws. Ultimately, however, it's up to you to decide how you want to mulligan. If you want to keep hands that have 1 land and a soul ring, or if you refuse to mulligan down and start with less than 7 cards in your opening hand, you can do that. But if that's the case, you should be keeping the way you want to mulligan in mind when you build your deck and try to mitigate how luck dependent you are. At the end of the day, mulliganing isn't just about the hand. It's about how well your deck and your decisions work together. You can't control your early game draws, but you can control how prepared you are for them. So get to know your deck, practice those tough decisions, and most importantly, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.